Hello, I'm Jim Turk, Director of the Center for Free Expression, and I'd like to welcome you to the 7th in the Center for Free Expression series, Taming Big Tech, Exploring the Alternatives. I want to begin by acknowledging that Toronto, where I'm speaking to you from today, is the traditional territory of many First Nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also want to acknowledge Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed by multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Our conversation today is titled How to Reclaim Digital Platforms for Democracy in Canada. And it is being co-sponsored by the Edmonton Public Library, the Milton Public Library, the Thunder Bay Public Library, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library. And I would like to thank our co-sponsors. Our featured guest today is Wendy Chun. Wendy is Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media at Simon Fraser University. She leads the Digital Democracies Institute at Simon Fraser. She's also author of a number of books, Control and Freedom, Power and Paranoia in the Age of Fiber Optics, Programmed Visions, Software and Memory, Updating to Remain the Same, Habitual New Media, and Discriminating Data, all of which were published by MIT Press. Previously, Wendy was professor and chair in the Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University for a number of years, was visiting scholar at the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania, and a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. She's held a remarkable number of fellowships, including the Guggenheim, the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Academy of Berlin, and the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study at Harvard. Welcome, Wendy. It's an honor to have you with us today.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Wendy is going to be in conversation with Andrew Clement. Andrew is Professor Emeritus in the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto, where he coordinates the Information Policy and Research Program. He co-founded the Identity, Privacy, and Security Institute. With a PhD in computer science, Andrew has had a long-standing research and teaching interest in the social implications of information communication technologies and participatory design, and is the host of our Taming Big Tech series. Welcome, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Jim, and welcome, Wendy, and welcome to all those out in Zoom land, wherever you may be. I'm reaching you.
Oh, I'm sorry, before you start, Andrew, I wanted to just share with the audience the format for today's session. Andrew and Wendy will be in conversation for roughly 45 minutes or so, and then we'll turn to the audience for any questions that you may have. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button, and if you just click on that at any point, you can write out any question you may have, and I'd encourage you to ask your questions as they come to mind during their conversation. And as I said, about 45 or 50 minutes into the conversation, Andrew will turn to Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator of the center, to ask Ange to read the first question, and we'll go through as many of the audience's questions as we can. So if you do have questions, and we welcome your questions, please write them there as you think of them. I think that's about everything I have to say. Andrew, over to you and Wendy.
Okay, well, thank you again, Jim, and welcome, Wendy. And welcome to all those of you who are out in Zoom land, wherever you may be. I'm reaching you from my home on the West Coast in the unceded territories and ancestral homelands of the Salish-speaking peoples. I live near Victoria, which memorializes the imperial monarch in whose name this territory was stolen to establish what we call British Columbia. We're able to have this conversation thanks to a remarkable digital network whose physical features belie its popular characterization as this placeless cloud. In North America, at least, the fiber optic cables carrying the signals between us all still largely follow the railways that colonial agents pushed through the lands of countless First Peoples. The digital switching centers are mainly located in big featureless buildings in the core of our largest cities, right near where these railways met well over a century ago. This high degree of physical centralization of critical network infrastructure has greatly facilitated our signals intelligence agencies, the NSA in the United States and CSE in Canada, to intercept all our internet communication and selectively monitor it for perceived threats, mostly to, in the name of national security. Wendy, I'm so pleased to be and honored to be able to have this opportunity to talk with you about the topic of increasingly vital concern, how to reclaim digital platforms for democracy, particularly here in Canada. You bring an unusual but especially relevant background to this conversation, which I'm impressed and inspired by. Your first degrees were in both system design engineering as well as in media studies and cultural theory. You were the first to do that kind of combination. And you have long sought a close engagement between technologies and culture, not because you are a determinist in either of those, but you believe that engaging both of these areas more intensively moves us away from either of those extreme positions. And as a computer scientist who can't claim any credentials in the social sciences, but I'm acutely aware of the limitations of technical perspectives. And while many technical experts are thoughtful, intelligent, and caring people, the training that I received and which is still so prevalent in the technical domains makes it very difficult for us to bridge those sorts of gaps. And I think you have done that in an extraordinarily important way. What I'm especially interested in is your this Digital Democracies Institute that you've launched and now lead at Simon Fraser when you moved there, I guess in 2019, took up the Canada 150 chair. So I'd like to start by asking you, what do you mean by digital democracy? And what do you see as the principal challenges that digital tech poses for democracy? And then, I guess more specifically, how are you and your colleagues at the Digital Democracies Institute trying to address those challenges? So.
Well, thank you for that really wonderful and expansive first question. I too am on the West Coast right now, and in addition to your really wonderful land acknowledgement, I'd also like to say that I'm in Burnaby, and so therefore on the unceded traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. And I think that these land acknowledgements, however small, are really key to what we're trying to do at the Digital Democracies Institute as well. Because I think that, these are very small things that are part of a larger process of reconciliation and also hopefully reparations. And I think what's so key about is revisiting this history, which is so problematic, and thinking through the schools, the residential schools, and the reactions to the residential schools makes perfectly clear the limitations of certain data science approaches. For example, as we know, there was a lot of fatalities within the residential schools due to malnutrition, and this was well known. And rather than the government, giving the children more food, they sent in people to take their blood. So the nurses took their blood samples, etc. And it became part of a study to understand the impact of malnutrition on growth. And I think that what's so key about bringing the different disciplines together and thinking through something like the digital democracies is to fundamentally rethink our approach to data, to extraction, to information, etc. And here we're very much inspired by the work of Ariella Azoulay, who argues that rather than treating people as information sources, so we can set up a past, present, and future, what we need to do is treat folk as companions. And so think of ourselves as living within a potential history. So history isn't over, the past remains, and something else can always happen because of that. And I bring that up because I think that's so key to what we're trying to do in the Digital Democracies Institute, which is to acknowledge that there are different temporalities and moments and relations that currently exist. And one thing that we're trying to do is bring together diverse groups of people and disciplines to take on the hard problems that face us, problems such as misinformation, abusive language, and polarization. And to realize that we need to work across disciplines, because no matter how hard several people, people in these disciplines have been working, these problems remain. And they remain in part because we don't work together. So to be as concrete as possible, to think through something like misinformation, our project, which is called Beyond Verification, starts from the fact that fact-checking, although important, is not enough, right? So we all know that fact-checking sites are lag behind the deluge of global sources of misinformation or disinformation. Fact-checking can also spread the story inadvertently because corrections and stories often reach different audiences. And some people spread stories irregardless of facticity. They spread them because they find them to be compelling, to be funny, etc. And what we have to keep in mind is that the 2016 US presidential elections were both called the fake news elections and the authenticity elections, with the winner scoring high on both. And so one thing we're saying is, fact-checking is important, but let's flip it a little and ask ourselves, what makes any piece of information feel compelling or true or authentic, regardless of facticity? And to understand this relationship between authenticity and media, what's key is thinking through media studies, human rights analyses, because there's a long history of people finding things like fiction. For instance, you see a film, you find it to be true, even though it's not factually correct or incorrect. So what would it mean to understand and to evaluate news on the basis of something like authenticity and try to then relate it to facticity, or try to understand why it is that certain pieces of information go viral, what kind of relationships are key to creating different forms of trust or not?
Well, that's great. So let's dig into a particularly vivid and relatively recent example of this, and it relates to the 2016 election even, and that is the case of Facebook, which currently is the sort of poster child for big bad tech. I want to go back to 2018, and you talk about this in your podcast and in your book, and that was the Cambridge Analytica scandal. As others have pointed out, it was far from the only big tech scandal of that year, but it's I think it's still a particularly useful one to get into. And I wonder if you could talk about what you understand to be the sort of the crux of the problem that Cambridge Analytica and the kind of research that provided the basis for its claims of being able to assist in elections through the psychographic profiling of the electorate in its entirety, and using those kinds of sort of categories of personality type to then target messages that would be particularly evocative for the targeted individuals. I think that would be a great place to start, and then we can get into the history of where those category schemes came from.
So I think that the crux of it is linked to the historical, but I'll leave that for now because that's something we'll touch on later. But I think that what's key is to realize that, first of all, we don't know. We can't verify Cambridge Analytica's claims, right? And a lot of people have pushed back on it to say, there's a lot of snake oil here. And my reaction to this is to say, if we try to figure out again what it really impacted, what it really didn't impact, like that is at a certain extent unknowable, because if it worked, it worked not by discovering things, but by shaping things. And I think what's so key about Cambridge Analytica, and you can think of Breitbart and that whole constellation that came together around the Breitbart doctrine, is that in order to change politics, you have to change culture. And here they're not talking about discovering, they're talking about changing. And if we think of it in those terms, what was so key about Cambridge Analytica and that kind of work is that they're trying to figure out the conditions under which they can change behavior. And one thing that they rely on, and you see this as well when the Silicon Valley dudes talk about what they did wrong and they're very remorseful, is a certain behaviorist understanding of humans, right? They'll talk about addiction, dopamine, et cetera, et cetera. And what's key to realize is that these behaviorist models work sometimes, but not all times. But they work under very stressful conditions. So part of what what Cambridge Analytica and a lot of these social media algorithms try to do is create these agitated conditions, right? This is what people talk about when they talk about clickbait, right? The idea that you provoke people, you keep people provoked, you keep them on edge. Basically, you try to figure out their triggers. Because when people are extremely agitated, they will act in certain predictable ways. And so I think that one thing that's key is that in this idea of creating these agitated clusters that will act in ways or be pushed in ways that these corporations want these people to, what's key is that it's not like it's just focused on you. We're going to find out everything about you. We're going to stalk you until we know everything about you. But rather what's key is to figure out your network neighborhood. So people who are quote unquote like you. And the ways that these are constructed are really important because you can say that, Andrew, you're like many people. You might like Harry Potter, and therefore you're like a huge swath of humanity. But the likes that matter are ones that divide. So if you go to the history of some of these, there's a reason why race and racism was so key, because it was such a divisive issue. So they look at they try to find these issues which are extremely divisive, that put people into these clusters where they believe they can trust others because they share a certain risque or different position. And then from there, try to move people in certain ways.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. I think making the point about seeing or shifting from a focus on the individuals, which is often comes up in privacy and data protection. Our data has been stolen from us as individuals when we are sort of sovereign and we need to have control over that. I mean, I think that's very important, but what you're drawing attention to here is the way in which that's used, not just to target you individually, but to create groups, or you call them network neighborhoods, that can act in similar ways because they are, and this I sort of like from your I guess a tagline for your book, which you say is about big data and machine learning, or how big data and machine learning encode discrimination and create agitated clusters of comforting rage. I think that's pretty vivid way of talking about this process of amalgamation and categorization that then has a political potency well beyond that of the individual, and that also we need to think of ourselves in those clusters and how our affiliations with others are formed through these media. And we'll get into talking also about the algorithmic amplification that helps create those. But let's talk a bit about the history of statistics and and categorization and discrimination, which you deal with in your book, because I think, and I certainly, as someone who, one of my first jobs was working with statistical packages back in the 1960s, actually, of distinguishing between discriminating. It was called discriminant analysis, a multivariate discriminant analysis of trying to help fisheries researchers decide, when they caught a salmon out in the ocean, which river it was going to go up, with the Fraser or the Skeena, or and so on. So I was totally unaware that discriminant analysis has rather an unfortunate history. While it's a powerful technique and can be used for all kinds of useful things, like helping protect the salmon runs, that was not where it started. And maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so to start with your specific example of linear discriminant analysis, because there are other forms of statistical tools, methods like correlation, et cetera, that also have equally dubious histories.
Yeah.
So linear discriminant analysis, of course, comes from the work of Sir Ronnie Fisher, who was a eugenicist. And it started with his students trying to figure out the differences between races based on skull sizes. And so if you go to the classic text on SVM, so support what becomes support vector machines, Karina Cortez says, well, Sir Ronnie Fisher came up with the first algorithm for pattern recognition and cites that article. And everyone talks about his iris data set, and it's still used to this day to understand discriminant analysis, but no one discusses the first paragraph where he talks about his students looking at skull size, or his citation of Mahanomola's work, where skull size there was trying to understand race mixing in India. But I think what's also key is, as you noticed in your lifetime even, there's been this move in terminology from discriminant analysis to recognition. And these are many of the same tools. So how did we move from discrimination to recognition? And what's at stake in that change of terminology? And that has a larger political, cultural, philosophical history that we can discuss. But what's key is to understand that transition within technical language within the so-called culture of and politics of recognition, which will take place right about that time as well. But as you know from the work that you did, the features that are most valuable in analysis like this are the features that are most discriminating, right? So you presume in advance that there are two populations that are different, but they share a certain feature, but the feature is supposed to be radically different in each of these different groups, right? So you presume in advance the separation and mixture. Mm-hmm. And that was very much linked to the desire to have clean-cut notions of races with humans, because we share certain things, but the idea was certainly we must be able to figure out these other things which are the most discriminating, and then we can say because they differ this way, then they differ in intelligence and other things, et cetera, et cetera. But what's so key is that the basis of eugenics goes beyond pattern recognition. So correlation, which is considered to be, the end all and be all of big data, right? So we have correlation rather than causation. We know how things are actually linked versus theories of causality. Correlation emerged in the same time period, early 20th century eugenics. And it was the desire of eugenicists to shape the future based on things that they believed did not change in the past, present, and future. So they would look at various traits and say, okay, if somebody's father was an alcoholic, you were an alcoholic, then your children would be alcoholics. That this was a measurable correlation. And then the point was to then change the present so you could have the future that you would follow these static patterns. And so, of course, when eugenics, was after World War II, there was a move away from eugenics. Even before World War II, towards both Mendelian genetics and as well statistics. And part of the move towards statistics was to not hold on to the strong predictive element of eugenics. And so to use it far more to analyze populations that exist and not insist that this therefore is strongly predictive, but rather this is descriptive. And there are all sorts of problems with even saying it in those terms, but that what was key is that with the emergence once more of big data, you have that strong emphasis on prediction again.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, talking about prediction, but looking at sort of contemporary approaches to prediction or and of sort of nudging people to do as they're as predicted, we see a shift in the techniques from, well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from what you're talking about, discriminant analysis or recognition, where you try to identify, and label groups that are distinguished from each other through their characteristics, as then sort of as sort of an a priori, and as I understand in the Facebook Cambridge Analytica case, a priori categories as to whether you're an open personality or I forget the other ones that were used, to current, well, let's call them AI techniques, and I want to put AI in brackets there, and I'm not going to use the spell out the I word because I don't think it's about intelligence. I mean, artificial stupidity is often just as appropriate as artificial intelligence. Let's use a label of AI for contemporary techniques, big data techniques, where the categories are not necessarily created and labeled as such. They're just the correlations that you were talking about, and the correlation that, say, Facebook and Google, particularly in their recommender systems for both deciding what's the content or the ad that's going to be served, or who you might want to affiliate with or be a friend with, is derived from the massive data that they have collected about you. And I don't know to what extent they actually categorize people, but they don't have to if all they're really interested in is getting you to click in a way that keeps you on the site and keeps you, engaged is the euphemism that is used here, but that keep you, clicking away and being excited in the process of wanting to respond. Can you distinguish between how I've characterized those two different approaches? I mean, is that a real distinction? It seems to me that the end is still very much the same, although the techniques have now shifted and become actually more opaque, because you can't then explain. The AI systems are, famously have a problem with explanation. They can't explain why you got this particular message or not, because it's buried deep in their millions of parameters for their AI model. Is that a fair way of thinking about it? And is that helpful?
Yeah, there's a bunch of things there, and a bunch of ways into answering that question. So one, just as a side note, it's interesting that you talked about both openness and then the I word, because actually, so the Ocean model is a eugenic model.
Ocean being the model that Cambridge Analytica used.
Psychographics, yeah.
Yeah, psychographics.
Is itself a eugenic model and believes that psychological traits themselves are unchanging, right? And the O for openness used to be I for intelligence. So it's just very interesting that there's another two that you used. But I think that's, so one thing is to say, even when these are, because there's a back and forth between these methods. That's important to keep in mind, right? So one thing you were describing is something that people might consider classically to be the supervised versus the unsupervised form of machine learning, right? So with the supervised model, the groups exist beforehand, and you're trying to figure out how best to train it to recognize what you already have decided should be recognized, right? The unsupervised model, or the ways of quote unquote discovering clusters, right? Which is say, look, we have this, and then, you know, based on this, we're going to find where you are and what you're likely to do, right? But even that notion of clustering is it's you know, it's network neighborhood still, right? It's nearest neighbor. And the fundamental presumption is that you are like your neighbor. And further, that these clusters that emerge are clusters of sameness. And then from these clusters and this clustering, you then figure out recommendations, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, a classic example of a give and take, it would be something like Netflix, right? So Netflix has a lot of data, especially once it started streaming, right? And then it produced this huge, you know, massive data, then did some matrix decomposition, figured out various axes, right? That seemed to explain a lot of the data, but these were not features in the sense that they knew what these features were, right? So they looked at this vector and they said, well, this is kind of like female romantic lead in an action movie, right? And then, you know, went through and tried to decipher what these axes are, and then use them to either create new ones or to figure out different forms of recommendation. Right? And that Netflix is special that way because it's so open about this give and take, and it's creating large and very expensive films. But the idea, again, is to create these quote unquote clusters where you discover modes of sameness and then move from there. And what we have to realize is that this is a real perversion of what neighborhoods are or should be, right? Your neighbor is supposed to be not your friend. You know, when they say the neighbor is supposed to be something different than who you are. And if the neighbor equals who you are, you're living in a fundamentally segregated neighborhood. And the concept homophily, which grounds this, comes from studies of segregated residential US housing. So it should be no surprise that what's emerging are angry segregated clusters.
Yeah, maybe you could say a bit more about clustering and this idea of homophily, which is, I mean, liking oneself or liking others like you, I suppose is its origins. But because you talk about it in your work of how you have to break out of those tendencies to, as you were sort of characterizing as sort of gated you know, communities in a way, or protected communities. And there's seems to me that there's a fundamental tension here that needs to be resolved, because of course people want to in some ways hang out. It's much easier to hang out with people who are already familiar with you, because you can start talking about, you know, interesting new things without and also staying safe at the same time. But that if that is too much of that in a way, then you create these communities. While we like to think of them as benign, they actually are also about distinguishing who's not in it. And then we can see that those communities or clusters or neighborhoods become you know, deployed in particularly in political campaigns as ways of exciting people to you know, dismiss, demonize others. But we need to make the connections across those as well. So could you say a little bit about that tension about, if I'm getting that right, between the need to, you know, and desire to hang out with people like yourself, but also to not create the barriers that then lead to the demonization of others? I think that's part of your work.
Yeah, and I would push back a little on the idea that if you hang out with people like you, you're somehow more comfortable and less, because what's so interesting, if you just think of this Frances Haugen's leak, was when
she was the Facebook whistleblower to testify for Congress recently. Yeah.
So when she testified, she said that when so Facebook tried to limit your feed to your friends and family in order to make things less acrimonious, and actually things got worse. So there's
okay.
a way in which limiting it to actually people who are like you, and it's presumed all the time in the literature. They say homophily works because you're comfortable around with people who are like you. And that is actually a question.
Yeah,
And
okay,
I think
fair
we have
enough,
to
fair
question
enough.
why that's true, especially given the data that we've gotten from Facebook about that, which is why I think instead of comfort, we could talk about comforting rage. It's when you're with people who are like you, you can engage in comforting rage.
Yeah.
And so I think that's important to keep in mind. And the other thing is, so with homophily, my point isn't that homophily doesn't work, that people don't sometimes like being with people who are like them, but that it's become the default, like similarity breeds connection, et cetera, in so many recommender systems and search engines, et cetera. And it's unclear that it's always true. So what's fascinating when you go back to the sociological study from which the term homophily emerged, so the Columbia Bureau of Applied Sociological Research did a housing study. This was post-World War II. There was an intensive housing crisis. This was a time when housing projects were still mainly white. And there was this question as to whether the US government should go forward with private mortgages, and we know this will be private mortgages for white Americans, or to keep up public housing. And so they produced this housing study, and we know what happened, right? This is why we have the incredible wealth disparity we do right now in the United States. But this housing study looked at two different projects. One was an all-white co-op that was in New Jersey, and the other one was a biracial public housing project in Pittsburgh. And they chose them to understand the impact of tenant morale and public housing on democratic spirit. And they first chose the all-white co-op because they viewed this as a success case. It was some union workers getting together, they had this disastrous condition, and then they all became this great melting pot and became very politically active. And what's interesting is that this housing project still exists. In fact, the people have not sold the property, even though it's extremely valuable right now in New Jersey.
Yeah.
This is Winfield, New Jersey. The other one, Addison Terrace, was chosen because it was biracial, 50% Black, 50% white. And it was biracial, not integrated. So buildings were separated by race, except for one building, which had people separated, floors separated by race. And interestingly enough, that was the housing, the building that had the least problems. And so they did the study because they wanted to know, like, what is the impact specifically on white residents of living in biracial housing. And so they separated everything out by race, and they wanted to know the impact on Black Americans and the ways in which this seemed to finally follow through on the Democratic Creed, because they, for the first time, moved into brand new housing with incredible appliances, things that they were denied before from both sides, right? And so they had this long study, but there were three questions they asked, which became central to the emergence of the work on homophily. And that is, who are your three closest friends? Do you think housing projects should be biracial? And do you think the people in the housing, the races in the housing projects get along? They asked everybody these questions, but in order to show where homophily existed, so first they said that homophily isn't 100%, right? So they said there's heterophily and there's homophily. We don't know when homophily happens, when heterophily happens. So we're not gonna, our project is not about proving homophily always exists. And they said homophily as well is not a motivating factor. And they said, well, it does exist in two circumstances. One is race, one is gender. And they said that actually what's driving status homophily, this homophily that you see due to status, is really value homophily. People preferring to be friends with people who have the same values as themselves. And the way that they showed this was they said that white liberals over-select white liberals by something like 34%, and white illiberals select white illiberals by something like that, if not more. Now, in order to make that case, they took out all the responses of the Black residents, because they said there were not enough Black residents who had liberal or illiberal friends. I'm sorry, ambivalent or illiberal friends. Okay, so what that shows us is that in their mind and in their study, values never crossed races. That there was like, and then to make that point that white liberals over-select and white illiberals over-select, they actually got rid of the category of white ambivalence. So these were people who thought the project shouldn't be biracial, but the races got along. And that was actually the largest category of white residents. So based on taking out most of their data, they said, okay, look, there is value homophily. And now this has become like one of the most cited studies on homophily. And it's presumed that, of course, similarity breeds connection. But if you go back to the data and even their statements about the data and their larger analysis, they show that there were many acquaintances across the races, as well as friendships, but not quote unquote close friendships.
Yeah. Well, that's a helpful corrective, I think, to some of that benign, naive assumptions about familiarity and homophily. Let's talk a bit about what to do about that. This, particularly in the area of speech and expression, and bring in the sort of current algorithmic techniques for creating clusters. And I'm thinking specifically of the Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression, which I understand you have just joined as a member or this past year. And two previous guests, Taylor Owen and Jamil Jaffer. Taylor is currently a member and Jamil was one from last year. And to look at their report on from last year called Harms Reduction, a 6-step program to protect democratic expression online. And that came out in January at this time last year. And in that report, they reference a number of times the role that algorithms play in, they don't use the terms clustering and homophily and so on, but the role that algorithms play in amplifying certain forms of speech, and I guess indirectly of creating affiliations of these clusters, not their term, but these clusters of comfortable rage, I think is the term, comforting rage. Now, those. Let's talk about, if you can, the relationship between that report and then the government actions that presumably were informed by this. It's quite a significant report. It was headed by Beverly McLaughlin, who is former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and so on. But none of that mention of algorithm showed up in the government proposals. Bill C-36 about hate speech originally, and then their online harms proposed bill, which they conducted, I'll put in quote marks, a consultation on. Are you familiar enough with that work in terms of what the commission saw or hoped would be the effect of that, and where do you think attention to algorithms, which is something that you and Taylor in particular bring to the discussion, and you're now in your second year, and I presume you're working on another report. Can we introduce, or what's the hope of introducing an attention to algorithmic amplification or sorting or into the public policy discourse more widely than this report?
I think that's the hope. I can't really speak to what the commission did in the first year. I read the report clearly, and I think the world of everybody who was on that report. And I think that what they were pointing towards in terms of the importance of algorithmic amplification is certainly important. And from what I understand, is something that governments around the world are taking on. right? So I understand there is some flexibility now, given what happened with the elections and things that are moving around, that I imagine that the Canadian government will come up with different looking bills than they did previously. But I do think the question of algorithmic amplification and the whole question of, as you put it earlier, accessing this, and saying, look, we don't understand what's going on with these algorithms. How can we audit them? How can we look into them, et cetera, is something that the EU and many other groups are looking at. And of course, responsible AI going forward. So I do think that the question of algorithmic amplification will come up in many different forms of legislation, from privacy to competitive competition, et cetera.
Yeah, so it was good to see algorithmic amplification mentioned in the report. The recommendations I thought were a bit mild or weak, in that sense that they called for some transparency in terms of recommendations, but or actually it wasn't so much recommendations as sort of content moderation, which is a very limited part of the application of these AI and algorithmic techniques more generally within these social media platforms. And so I wonder if you or others are trying to expand the scope of addressing sort of algorithmic aspects, and specifically around accountability, of holding them accountable. How are these platforms accountable for their algorithmic practices, their automated decision making, or however you want to call that? That's what was the term that was used in the Bill C-11, the reform to the privacy legislation, because I think that seems to be a frontier for the discussion. And then if you can relate that to your concerns about clustering, sort of antagonistic clustering, and then how to get out of that. Can you reform, even through very strong accountability of algorithms? Can you get to the kind of let's call it intercluster communication across the divides that are being created by these algorithms? Do you think there's prospect for that?
I think accountability is key, and I do think that the work going forward is going to emphasize accountability, but our report hasn't been written, so I can't really speak to it.
Yeah, okay.
But I do think that the question that you bring up about accountability is the question that every government is asking. And every government is looking at different ways of thinking through this. What I would emphasize, and what's great is what has already been published, is that as well as the commissioners, there is a public forum, and they have the assembly, and they published their recommendations, which are fantastic and go into questions of accountability.
Yeah, I actually, just a comment on that. I was in some ways more impressed by the Citizens Assembly report in terms of its attention to questions of algorithms, and also drawing the connections to the capture, exploitation of personal information and its use in these systems than the Commission's report did, actually. So I thought that, and well, we can get into talking a bit more about that, but go on.
Yeah, I think that the Citizens Assembly's report for this year as well is really wonderful and expansive. And I can't say what we're going to say, so let me talk about this as a researcher and as a rather than as a commissioner. But I do think that what's absolutely key, and you emphasized earlier, is transparency isn't enough, right? And not only is the transparency of what, right? So there are, of course, some people like Christian Sandvik who have really argued that what you need is strong whistleblower protection, because these corporations are really smart, and they'll deluge you with information if you ask for it. And so what you need to know, you don't know, which is why whistleblower protection is so key, because there's got to be some sort of inside understanding of what's going on. And so I do think that some of the work that's been done around that is key around thinking through the limitations of transparency. I also think that, what's so key about some other reports that have come out is that there's a way in which, if we only talk about algorithms, we overlook what they're amplifying. That there's a way of making tech companies somehow responsible for everything, rather than trying to think through some of the social ills such as racism, et cetera, that are driving some of this. And so there's a way that sometimes people can not examine some really thorny social conflicts and problems by pretending that if these algorithms weren't there, somehow, society would be necessarily better. Which I think is the flip coin of somehow imagining that technology will fix these problems for us.
Yes, yeah.
So I think that there's got to be some grappling around, what is being amplified and how it's being amplified. Not to say that it's not responsible for amplification, because clearly, that yes, but that the question of what needs to be done in order to take it on is larger than just thinking that if we fix tech, we're going to fix the world.
Yeah. Well, no, I really appreciate that. And actually going back to what we were talking about at the beginning about your Digital Democracy Institute, one of the concerns that I have, even as trying to tackle big tech, is that their problems, are defining the agenda, and inevitably they have to, but doesn't that at the same time run the risk of actually obscuring a more fundamental question, which is what would a sort of, well, not a digital democracy per se, but a democracy that takes account of and advantage of digital technologies in a way that achieves or helps achieve enduring ideals of a democratic society, rather than just try to correct features that come up in big tech. So I really hope that you can shed some light on that in your institute. So we're just about time for inviting the audience to make some questions, and I don't see that there are any yet. So please, we've given you a fair amount of things to react to, I hope. But as a last question for you, Wendy, in this part, could you point to some resources that you think interested audience members might take advantage of? And in particular, you make a point about ensuring that we are attentive to those voices who have not been part of the conversation so far, and very often that's the people and representatives of those who have been harmed by the practices to date. So can you share thoughts on what you think? Maybe it's things that have inspired you particularly, or that are relevant to this discussion. And we will post these on the event's website, and along with pointers to some of your earlier work and your recent book too, the Digital Discriminate or Data Discrimination.
Yeah, I think that what's so key is that there's a whole group of people working on these issues and have been working on these issues since the mid-1990s. So I would point to work by Lisa Nakamura, who has been looking at questions of race to the formation of the internet as a mass medium and to social media. I think as well, Ruha Benjamin's book, new book is great, as well as
what's it called?
So I can't believe that right now it is completely
okay.
on
We'll
my bookshelf.
okay, we'll get it. We'll get this and post it. But yeah.
So Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression, as well as Andre Brock's book. Sorry, I had my collection of books in front of me. Race After Technology,
Okay.
as well as Captivating Technology, which is the edited collection that she put together. I think that some of Virginia Eubanks's work on eugenics has been key. And I'm happy to put them all together in a list.
Oh, that would be great. And you've also, I think, mentioned speculative fiction. I mean, as a ways of thinking about a future that could be, given, the resources available, but that are not, the ideas are not, well circulating at this point.
Yeah, so I think that sort of Moya Bailey's work is fantastic, as well as Kara Keeling's Queer Times, Black Futures, to try to bring together critical theory and critical fabulation together in order to imagine and to engage different presents and futures.
Good, yeah. So it's certainly big tech offers and spins lots of visions of the future, which tend to grab our attention in ways that maybe drive out some other ways of thinking about how to do this. So that would be great. So, Ange, can we have the first question, please?
Yeah, and I do want to remind attendees they can use the Q&A button to ask questions. And yeah, and the first question is from Claire, and Claire says, your discussion has been very interesting. I want to ask you specifically to speak more concretely about steps we as a society should take to reclaim digital platforms for democracy. If you were advising the federal government, what would you be advising them to do?
Oh, that's a huge one. I would say that one thing that is key is that when we're thinking through this, we can't focus on one thing in particular, like only focusing on content moderation, for example, or making quote unquote some things transparent overlooks the larger question of what should be gathered at all. So I think you need to think through the larger aspects of this, because if you look at, for instance, the EU and their new digital rights legislation, what they're proposing is that researchers have access to information that's being gathered so that researchers can check to make sure that the claims being made by platforms that they are moderating, they're doing X, Y, and Z can be verified. And clearly having, third parties such as researchers have access to materials is absolutely key, and vetting it and making sure that it follows certain ethical rules, but that evades the larger question about what should be gathered to begin with. And here, I think that's a question of privacy rather than simply regulation. So I think there needs to be a larger overview in which the different forms and branches of government get together in order to think through this, as well as competition law. Because clearly there's huge implications for competition law here as well. I would say as well, it's so, for me, I think that so much emphasis is being put right now on questions of regulation, which are important, but there needs to be also emphasis on education and on giving people a way to understand, to access, and to change how they're beholden to certain platforms or how platforms operate or not. I think that what's absolutely key to a thriving democracy is a certain level of conflict or dissensus or agonism. And what's so horrific about how these platforms also operate is that they shut down everything. And by doing so, they often hurt the people they claim to protect. So if you look at the ways in which some of the automated systems work, they've been shown to discriminate against the very people they're supposed to protect. So people who use Black English, the first groups to be censored online were LGBTQ+ AIDS activists. And so we need to think through what kinds of dialogue we need in a thriving democracy. And part of that conversation and that understanding is larger than simply regulation. So I would say the production of alternative forms and understandings of platforms. I would also say that what's so key is to understand that these things are always changing. So regulation always seems to be trying to regulate what's already happened. And that instead of viewing it even in terms of specific things, like we're going to look at, Facebook. Facebook is now trying to, become metaverse. That's going to be a different set of issues. So I think that rather than thinking platform specific, what people need to think through or address are what is problematic about what is currently being done. And then once that's figured out, then you can have a larger set of reactions towards that issue. Is it the fact that, privacy and is being compromised in certain ways so that people are being exploited? Is it X, Y, and Z? Is it the combination of things? Is it political advertising, et cetera, et cetera? Or what is it about this that's so manipulative? So I think that there's got to be some discussion at the level of what the feature is, and then thinking through a larger response.
Yeah. My previous guest, Conrad van Finkenstein, who has a long history of being a federal court judge and chair of the CRTC and so on, also spoke to this issue and the need for a much more comprehensive approach. And Wendy, you mentioned that, I think pointed out some problems, limitations of regulation, and called for greater education. I presume you're talking here not just educating in the academic, formal sense, but in sort of public education, so that there's a much better, sort of popular understanding of what's going on and what's at stake and what's possible. And he called for a so-called royal commission on, well, he didn't give it a name, but at least on, say, digital platforms, so that we could dig in deeply through a public education process that brought in expertises from a variety of perspectives as a basis for addressing the challenges that these platforms pose across a whole series of issues, of not just sort of siloed ones of data protection here and then antitrust there and speech regulation over there. So we'll see. The Citizens Assembly sounds like a step, or at least is at least providing a more open and informed way than has been done so far around this. So.
And some of these interventions might not look like the normal kinds of interventions. There's theater and there's performance, there's poetry, there's other forms of workshops that are in place right now to help people, like Alex Uhas did a fake news poetry workshop where people came together and they produced poetry about their experiences with fake news. Yana Yukin did this amazing performance where people were asked to fill out the kinds of questionnaires you would usually use to figure out your political affiliations that are used for advertising, et cetera. And then you were placed on the online stage according to how you answered. And then there was a bot that was trained on left news sources, a bot that was trained on right news sources, and live actors. And there was this enactment of exactly what's going on and how you're positioned. So I think we can think creatively about not simply informing people, but getting them to engage and imagine the solution. So the solutions have to come from all of us.
Yeah, that reminds me, one of my colleagues at the Faculty of Information, David Phillips, who's a surveillance researcher and also a playwright and actor and thespian, wrote a play called Clusterfucked, which had a very energetic troupe of 4 actors acting out the various ways in which clusters are formed around, say, these statistical variables and statistical features, and gave it a liveliness and a way of seeing it in action as they moved and formed the clusters and things like that, that I thought was just marvelous public pedagogy. And I think we could do a lot more of that kind of stuff. Yeah. So, Ange, how about another question?
Yeah, the next question is from Anna, and Anna asks, is it possible for a national government?
Ange?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
You seem to.
I can hear her.
Oh, okay. I'm frozen.
Okay. Sorry, Wendy, I'll just ask this to you in case Andrew gets cut off. He will rejoin in a minute if it freezes on him. Can you hear me, Wendy?
Yes, I can.
Okay. The next question is from Anna, and Anna asks, is it possible for a national government to have a significant effect on the behavior of giant transnational technological corporations like Amazon, Google, or Facebook, who are undermining their country's democracy?
I think that you can say yes, and you can point to certain examples that have had huge impacts. You could say the US government with Section 230 has had an incredible impact on this. So Section 230 is part of the Communications Decency Act, which was introduced in 1996 in order to regulate quote unquote indecent content. And because the term indecent content was so large, they decided that they would protect people like AT&T who relayed information. So they would not be prosecuted for the information they relayed. Now, what's interesting about the Communications Decency Act is that everything of that was overturned. Right, so they did not, in the end, regulate indecent content on the internet, but but that release for platforms is still in place. So you could say that part of the problem that we've had is it has been produced by national governments. So national governments have had, especially the US government, has had a huge impact on the situation that we're in. So I would flip the question a little bit and not imagine that it's always national governments to combat these, but the ways in which the problem that we have is because of certain national policies. Then the other thing that people will always point to is the GDPR in Germany, as well as the 24-hour takedown provision as part of German law, which says that you have to take down materials within 24 hours. Now, this has led the technology companies to say that this is being abused now, and people are flagging all sorts of legitimate content, and it's being used against those very people that they were supposed to protect. But one can think through these. But I think that what's absolutely key is to understand, A, how national governments have enabled the situation we're in, and then B, to understand the importance of intergovernmental cooperation in order to take on certain issues, and the ways in which platforms will respond in many ways to the strictest law, right? So because Germany has this in place, they'll say that this, they then put this through all the EU, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we need to think through some of the impacts that they have already had.
Yeah, if I heard you correctly, I think just a minor correction. The German law is separate from the GDPR, which is an EU-wide law. So those are different. But to your general point, about the need for international cooperation, that's an incredibly important one, and has come up before, and in particular, the recent now former commissioner, the UK privacy commissioner, the information commissioner, and who's Liz Denham, and was the former privacy commissioner here in province of British Columbia, actually the information and privacy commissioner, and formerly with the Office of the Privacy Commission Canada, has called for what she refers to as a Bretton Woods of privacy, which echoes the post-World War II agreement of bringing all countries together to develop a new global financial order. And she's calling for a sort of a global data protection order. And I hope that also, if that goes ahead, of course, can deal with a number of these other issues, or at least have them within the frame so that they're not excluded. Ange, another question. I dropped out, so apologies if I missed something, but I seem to be back online.
Yes, the next question is from Garth, and Garth asks, how does loss of trust and authority interact with democracy's grounding in representation?
Oh, that's a great question. So first of all, yes, I said GDPR and then I forget what the German law is, but yes. So just, okay. So that's a huge question in terms of trust. And I want to flip it slightly differently, because a lot of people will say democracy is in crisis because people don't trust institutions, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that in order for democracy to work, you need skeptical citizens. You need people who question. Democracy is fundamentally based on us questioning and striving for and wanting something that's more fair and just. Now, where the problem lies, and this is where I think the crisis around quote unquote loss of trust, I find to be not the loss of trust that's the problem. It's the trust, it's the point in which questioning certain sources leads people or you to trust even more dubious sources. So when, questioning CNN then leads to, believing Epoch Times, I think that's the problem. I think it's this manipulation of a fundamental skepticism that's part of democratic governance and citizenship. That's the issue. And so to imagine that somehow there is this period where democracy doesn't demand that we constantly question and is for me the problem. So I would say to intervene into discourse like that is not to say, not to keep saying, that's why you shouldn't distrust X or you shouldn't Y or blah, blah, but then flip it back to say, well, why do you trust this? Like, why do you think this is, and then to get involved in this long understanding of what it means to trust and the ways in which trust and truth are intertwined. Just to give you a different example of this, consider something like global climate change. That's an issue where people have said, well, the issue is people don't trust scientists, and that if they just trust scientists and models, then things would work out properly. And I certainly believe in global climate change and that people need to work on global climate change. But there's the fact that some people want to view science as absolutely above contestation has led to this other side where people can say, well, this is incorrect, right? They used this variable was called the cheap variable. So therefore all global climate change models are wrong. It comes from a situation where the sort of struggle around scientific truth, which we should understand, it has been shielded. And so I think that what's absolutely key is, again, this sort of understanding of struggles over truth and dissensus. And to go back to the examples that we were talking about art and what art can do, one thing that a lot of the critical interventions into social media platforms accept is that people, to a certain extent, view themselves as characters when they're online. So your Instagram is different than you realize that there are certain things that are done, you play with certain things, et cetera, et cetera. But that's completely elided when people talk about the way social media affects people, right? So we'll talk about marionettes, you're being completely manipulated. So I think what's absolutely key is to think through this sort of gray territory. We need to struggle through this because democracy is about struggle.
Yeah. Okay, Ange, can we have the next question?
Yeah, the next question is from Jerry. Jerry asks, there have been numerous reports recently of technology companies building strong relationships with governments and infiltrating government circles. Do you have any information of this? And if so, how do you think these partnerships will affect public policy?
That is not an issue that I work on, but clearly it is a key one. I looked at some historical cases. You can think through the examples that Andrew, you started off with just the formation of the NSA, et cetera, the RAND Corporation, but this is not something that I currently research.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and just to build on that, in terms of the state surveillance, the NSA and CSE in Canada, of the signals intelligence agencies putting in their sensors to collect information, basically all of the internet traffic, and that's their upstream program. That is a result of their cooperation with the telecom companies. And another surveillance program of the NSA, which was in some ways, well, it was the first one that was announced out of the PRISM program. The NSA claimed that it had direct access to the servers of the major tech companies, Google and Facebook and so on. Now, the companies pushed back and said, well, it's not quite direct, but there is clearly a close alliance going on there. It's very hard to tell exactly what's going on for obvious reasons, but the ways in which these platforms are collecting such massive amounts of personal information makes it a kind of a honeypot, so to speak, for various actors to want to get in there and have a look, and notably, the government ones. And at the same time, these corporations, to varying degrees, rely on government's forbearance or other, other measures for their own futures. So I think it's definitely the case that we're seeing an increasingly tight connection. Interestingly, yesterday or the day before, I guess it was yesterday, in the Toronto Star, there was an article reporting on the, well, it was the, well, it's called the revolving door, or out of the regulatory capture group at the McMaster University, that looked at the ways in which individuals who either work in the senior positions at the big tech companies in Canada had government positions previously, and vice versa. And some, well, the current in Facebook and in Google, the senior policy people worked at the Privacy Commission for a number of years, so you have to ask, what were they bringing to those companies? Why were they so attractive, and how does that shape their interventions now? And I think there's a good case that can be made that the government policy making in Canada is heavily shaped by the interests of these companies, and that's something we should be very alert to. So, next question, Ange.
Yeah, just a quick question from Max. Max says, Wendy, in the resources you give the center to be posted with the video of the session, could you share the links to information or examples of the alternative forms of engagement that you mentioned?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Could you say just a little bit about those, what forms of engagement that you're referring to there?
I presume there would be Yana Yukin's performance, left, right.
Oh, okay.
As well as, Rupa Vasudevan as well came up with a really wonderful browser extension called Data Double. And what happens is you start off with a photograph of yourself. And then based on your traffic, your web traffic, the photograph will distort over a period of a couple of weeks. And then at the end, you'll get an explanation of why and how your photograph changed. And I think that's just a very amazing, visceral way of understanding that there is this constant capture and change. And that's in relationship to some of your actions of you and people like you. And I think that having some of those in place and thinking through this through a larger rubric is absolutely key.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular example, but it's I presume it's a reminder of the ways in which what we see on the screen or interact with on our devices is actually a version of ourselves that has gone through these algorithmic processes, because that's how you are, or how these platforms keep you engaged by using the fragments of your life to shape things that then are presented to you. And so you're caught up in this.
Yeah. No, and I think another form of alternate engagement that's key is actually we don't have to accept the algorithms that we're given. We can actually think through different forms of machine learning that don't rely on cost functions and their minimization or loss functions, or different forms of optimization, or algorithms that are so based on that reduce the future to the past, right? So when algorithms are validated as true, or they're said, this is predicted, this is a predictive algorithm and it's, correct 95% of the time, they say this not based on the fact that this algorithm has actually predicted the future, but rather that it's predicted values that aren't part of its training set. And these values are usually either part of the same training set and the same set of data, and they've been just taken away during the training, so it's past data, or in the same way out of set data, so an entirely different data set. But what they're fundamentally predicting is the past, and they're validated as true when they do so. And I think that's incredibly limiting. And I think that we need to have a larger conversation about what kinds of algorithms we want, what kind of methods we want, and how can we draw from really rich understandings of history and learning, so that we can create algorithms or systems that really learn in the rigorous sense of learning, not simply repeating what we already know, so we always repeat the errors of the past.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. Ange, we have time for another question.
Yeah, the next question is from Lucy. Lucy says, thanks so much for this rich and informative conversation. Wendy, can you say more about what you see as the relations and differences between discrimination and recognition, particularly with respect to data and data analytics?
Yeah, so what's fascinating about the notion of recognition versus discrimination, or the relationship between the two, right? So you can go to, before there's pattern recognition, there was pattern discrimination. And they were basically tests that were done on lab rats to see if they could discriminate between certain shapes, right? So this is a square, this is a circle. And there were like fantastically bizarre experiments, which I'd love to talk about because they were just fascinating and bizarre. But from this notion of being able to tell one from the other was the idea that somehow there is this category. And recognition means being able to see, not notice slight differences, so that one can see a quote unquote class. Now, where I think it's really important to think through this move from discrimination to recognition is to also understand that what goes behind what was called the politics of recognition was this idea, especially fundamental to 80s multiculturalism and debates over 80s multiculturalism, was the so-called politics of recognition versus the politics of reparations. And the way that that was characterized, which to be honest was not a necessarily fair characterization, was that certain minority groups just needed recognition, right, to be told and to be acknowledged as full subjects, and that there was a tension between that and reparations, economic reparations. So it was called a recognition versus redistribution. And through that, this notion of recognition became this sort of benign notion of recognition, sort of separate from redistribution. But what's so key is that a lot of the philosophers who were philosophers of recognition would point to examples such as Indigenous nations within Canada and say, look, this is a question of recognition. But the most vociferous critiques of the so-called politics of recognition come from those very groups. So you can think of Glenn Coulthard's critique, for instance, of this notion of recognition, which doesn't deal with questions of redistribution and access to land. And so part of the bringing these two together is not simply that you have at the same time this weird move between what discourses of discrimination being framed in terms of questions of recognition, but recognition itself becomes this politically charged way to not think through issues of discrimination. And so then you have this situation now where the politics of recognition without redistribution have been taken up by the alt-right. So there's certain notion that we as a group should be recognized in order that things not be redistributed. And sorry, so it's much more complicated in the book, so I'm trying to condense it.
Right. Yes, well, we could talk about this for a lot longer, and you've written so extensively and in such great depth about this. So Wendy, I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us your work and your ideas. I found this very stimulating, and I've learned a lot, and I guess in particular an appreciation for both the history of some of these concepts and techniques, and how they are continuing to shape our practices today. The assumptions of race, of racial superiorities, and so on, of categorization for forms of social control, for instance, and well, there's just many things that you've covered that I think are very helpful for us. One I want to draw out in particular is your mention of the importance of whistleblowers, and that's in part because the Center for Free Expression has a growing program on whistleblower protection, and I believe that about to launch, or they have such a program, because it's vitally important. So just thanks for that alone. So that's great. So tomorrow, Ange will post the webcast of our conversation, so for others to enjoy. If you have appreciated this, I hope you have. I certainly have. I'd like you to be able to. I'd like to hear from any of you who have taken part so far. You can email us at CFE, that their website has the email address, or mine. It's andrew.clement@utoronto.ca. So we can learn more about how you've what you think of these sessions, possible guests, topics, these sorts of things. And I hope also that you'll join us next week for the next in our series. We have Tamir Israel, who's with CIPIC, the Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic, and he's going to be talking about in the golden age of surveillance, can privacy laws save us? And we'll make some connections to the previous sessions. So again, thank you very much, Wendy. I really appreciate this. Thanks, Ange, for your organizing behind the scenes, and also for passing on the very interesting questions from our audience. So back to you, Jim.
Well, thank you, Andrew. And I want to join you in thanking Wendy for a very stimulating discussion, and broad-ranging, and lots to think about. And we look forward to the resources you're going to share with us that we can post with the video tomorrow, so those who heard you and can dig into some of these things a little more fully. And as Andrew mentioned, our next event, and it's the next event in this series as well, the 8th, is with Tamir Israel from the Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic at the University of Ottawa. Tamir is really interesting in the sense that his work is driven by social justice considerations and covers diverse subjects arising, as he describes it, at the intersection of law and technology with a focus on privacy. So next Wednesday, January 26th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, I hope you'll join us. And if you want more information about the center's events, and as we mentioned at the beginning, this is the 7th in the Taming Big Tech Exploring Alternatives series. If you're interested in earlier videos of earlier events, please go to our website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca, and click on events, and you'll see them all there, as well as the many other events that we've had on related topics regarding freedom of expression, the public's right to know. So I want to thank you for coming, and again want to thank Andrew and Wendy, and hope to see you next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.